من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري وأحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to this module 1 of the Novel Support Links Caseworker training. My name is Neelam Kaki and I have the pleasure of presenting this module to you today. And the topic for this first module is trauma-informed practice. It will provide an understanding of what trauma-informed practice means and the various elements of trauma. The session will also illustrate the NSL process and highlight the role of the NSL caseworker as it relates to the process of novel support links and within a trauma-informed context. So what exactly is trauma-informed practice? So one definition of trauma-informed practice is working in a way that recognizes the consequences of trauma in an individual. So as you can see, there are three main aspects there when we think about trauma-informed practice. Recognizing that someone may have experienced trauma in their life, and that the effects of that trauma may still be present. To that end, NSL caseworkers should have an understanding of what constitutes trauma and how its impact may manifest in our applicants. One note is that this definition is limited to individual trauma, but trauma can also be intergenerational, which means it can be passed down from one generation to the next, and historic, which means that a traumatic experience may have occurred years or even decades prior to the birth of an individual, but may still have an impact upon their well-being. So let's think about why trauma-informed care is important and beneficial. So trauma-informed care builds trust and rapport, which is fundamental to any positive relationship, be it personal or professional. It also provides a holistic approach which recognizes the person as a whole and in their entirety. And this is one of the fundamental concepts of the project of Novel Support Links. The effects of trauma can creep into the lives of people in a way that is subtle and insidious, and it can manifest in different ways. So by understanding this and looking at the person as a whole, we can work with them in a way that's helpful. This in turn will provide them with the validation that what they have experienced is being honored and respected. This can be a very powerful and motivational tool for somebody who has experienced trauma in helping them heal and to move forward. As well as helping the applicant, a trauma-informed process also brings benefit to the caseworker. It provides a greater understanding of the person who they are working with and will help them in considering what services may be required. It instills compassion within us, and what greater quality than one that matches the attributes of our Creator. This approach also provides credibility as we are aware and educated in respect of the challenges that the other person may be facing. And finally, all of this combined makes our work more effective. So let's look deeper at what actually is trauma. So this definition is quite apt. It is a psychological, emotional response to an event or experience that is deeply distressing or disturbing. They can also be described as experiences that put either a person or someone close to them at risk of serious harm or death. And before we go into a bit more detail, I would like to share some statistics about how widespread traumatic experiences are within various populations. So in England, around 1 in 3 adults report having experienced at least one traumatic event. In Canada, in a study of almost 3,000 subjects, 76% reported exposure to at least one traumatic event in their life. And within the USA, approximately 1/2 of all individuals will be exposed to at least one traumatic event in their lifetime. And 8% will experience something known as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which we will look at more closely during this presentation. So we can see from those numbers that trauma is something that does affect a significant number of people. And this is particularly relevant when we look at the population that novel support links would be working with, namely widows and divorcees. So trauma can be described then as something that threatens one's physical or psychological safety. It's important to remember that people react very differently to trauma. Some may work through it in a relatively short period of time. This is a process known as natural recovery, while others may require support services and intervention to help them heal from their trauma. And the reactions to trauma can be influenced by people's levels of resilience, which can vary from one individual to another. It can depend on their past experiences, particularly their childhood experiences, and it can also be influenced by the presence of a support system. So one interesting example, which I read about in a book called The Body Keeps the Score by Vessel van der Kolk, cites an example where a married couple, of senior age, were on a drive in their car. The husband was driving and the wife was a passenger, and they experienced a car crash. It was a fairly severe accident, and had quite a serious impact on both of them. Now, what was interesting is that though they both were in the same car and it was the same event that occurred, their responses were incredibly different. Whereas the husband wanted to speak about the experience as a way to move through it and to try and rationalize what had happened, the wife reacted in a totally opposite way, whereby she shut down. She didn't want to think about the accident, talk about it, or visit the location. She literally was trying to block it out of her memory and from her system. So this is interesting because, presumably they had a very similar lifestyle, probably fairly compatible, yet their responses were so very different. And that really illustrates the point that we may come across somebody who has experienced a trauma, but that doesn't mean that their reaction to it would be the same as somebody else. Trauma is also different to stress, with the latter being part of normal life and something that we as humans are actually created to be able to manage. Our bodies have mechanisms that allow us to deal with stressful situations in a healthy way. Traumatic events, however, are more in depth and very different to a stressful event in our lives. And hence, it's possibly more likely that we will need intervention and further support compared to a stressful life experience. So we're going to do a group activity here. And the idea of it is to see examples of events that can be described as stressful versus those that are traumatic. So I will call out a phrase and I invite you to respond with whether you think it's stress or trauma. So the first situation is a missed mortgage payment. Would that be considered stress or trauma? That's an example of a stressful life event. The next one, witnessing violence, stress or trauma? A car crash, a divorce, experiencing domestic violence, car crash with severe injury. Eviction. War or combat situation. Bereavement. Unexpected death. A violent death, stress or trauma. Loss of employment. Moving house. Sexual abuse. So these are some examples of stressful life events versus traumatic experiences. Some of them may surprise you, particularly if we're looking at, for example, divorce or bereavement, again, situations which would be applicable to the people that we would be serving at NSL. And what is important to note is that whilst these situations may be stressful in and of themselves, there may well be circumstances surrounding these incidents which could actually move them into the category of a traumatic experience. So for example, if somebody has gone through a divorce following a marriage that was abusive, with instances of domestic violence, then certainly that experience would be classed as traumatic. Similarly, somebody facing bereavement in and of itself may be able to process that experience with little to no intervention or extra services. However, if that bereavement was due to a violent death or was unexpected, then it's quite realistic to expect that the person who experienced that may need extra levels of support. So there are three main types of trauma: acute, chronic, and post-traumatic stress. Acute trauma is usually related to a one-off traumatic experience rather than a repetitive one. So from the previous activity, some examples of that would be a car crash with severe injury or a violent death. Situations which are one-offs and unlikely to repeat. And most people will recover from this without need for great intervention or treatment, as long as they have a support system around them to help them through the process of grief and healing. Typically, that would be sufficient to help them through that experience. Chronic trauma describes a trauma that has been experienced over a prolonged period. So some examples of this would be domestic violence, sexual assault, any type of incidents that is recurring and sometimes goes through in cycles. Chronic trauma may need intervention or treatment, just given how deep-seated the trauma may be, particularly if that trauma began in the early years during childhood. Post-traumatic stress is a condition that may be experienced by those who have experienced trauma. It may manifest months or weeks after the incident, with symptoms such as nightmares, flashbacks, and avoiding anything that could remind them of that incident. Explained aches and pains can be a consequence of trauma, particularly if, again, somebody is typically quite healthy and now is experiencing physical symptoms that are not necessarily able to be explained, then this could be a manifestation of a traumatic incident. Also, those people who may already have some kind of health condition may find that it worsens following a traumatic incident. Trauma can also bring about susceptibility to major health conditions. And this has been illustrated quite starkly amongst children who have experienced adverse childhood events in a book known as The Deepest Well by Nadine Burke Harris. And in that book, she talks about how children who have experienced certain events within their early years are more susceptible to health conditions such as diabetes, heart disease, obesity, and so on. So once again, you know, trauma is not limited to impacting our mental state alone, but can actually have an impact on our physical well-being. In terms of the social impact of trauma, many individuals who have experienced a negative incident in their lives may withdraw from their activities that they previously used to enjoy. They may also isolate themselves from friends and family. And this has a knock-on effect to their recovery, because one of the peak indicators of being able to recover from a trauma is to have a social support system. And so by becoming isolated, in effect, there is a lack of access there to a potential source of healing. Trauma can also manifest itself in antisocial behavior by an individual. So they may turn to drugs or other types of chemicals to numb the pain that they're experiencing. And perhaps if they don't have information about more healthy types of coping mechanisms, then it may very well be that they demonstrate antisocial behavior, which is something that our caseworkers may come across in their work. And there'll be more on that later. In terms of the spiritual impact of trauma on an individual, it's not uncommon for people who prior had a very strong connection to their faith and their belief system to begin to question those beliefs, particularly if they have experienced chronic trauma, where they may feel that no matter how much they pray or how much they look towards spiritual sources for comfort, they're still experiencing these traumatic events in their life. It can also lead to decreased practice. For a start, trauma, for example, if it's created depression in somebody or physical aches and pains, it may be too demanding for them to actually continue to practice. And overall, there may just be a lack of spiritual connection. And once again, this is not necessarily a character flaw on that person, but it's more to do with some of the impacts of the trauma, some of which they may not even have control over. So let's take a look at how trauma actually impacts the brain. As I mentioned earlier, there is an actual physical response from the body when it is exposed to traumatic events. And so we'll look a little bit at that. So if we look at the amygdala, which is at the base of the brain, this is the limbic system, which is governed by instinct, not rationality. So that's the place where our brain determines our emotional component. And so when somebody has experienced trauma, particularly chronic trauma, the amygdala becomes much more active. And so the impact of that on an individual is that they're more likely to react in an emotional manner rather than in a rational way. So for example, if a client appears to be very emotional or unable to make decisions or recall events, it's worth considering that they may have experienced trauma in their past. And certainly if they add details to their history at different times, it's not the case that they're deliberately misleading, but it's just that their ability to think rationally could have been hindered. Which leads us on to the area known as the prefrontal cortex. This is the center of rational thinking. It governs it regulates our emotions. It's the center of decision making. And it's obviously a very important part of our brain function, particularly when we're thinking about thinking in a logical manner. However, this area of the brain literally shrinks when exposed to trauma, especially repeated trauma. So once again, this can impact a person's ability to make decisions. So if you come across an applicant who, no matter how much you try to explain to them the pros and cons, for example, of a particular option, they may have trouble processing that. And it may be difficult for them to weigh down on a particular course of action. Finally, if we look at the hippocampus, this is the area of the brain that's responsible for memory and differentiating between past and current events. So again, a very vital part of our brain, when we're talking about leading our daily lives. However, this too shrinks with consistent exposure to trauma, and subsequently an individual may have difficulty in recollecting past events. So again, if you come across an applicant who seems unsure or brings up new information that wasn't gathered initially, once again, rather than this being an attempt to mislead or provide false information, it could well be the impact of a traumatic incident on them. Let's look now at resilience in the face of trauma. Now, whilst traumatic experience can be very deep-seated within individuals, what we are learning from current research is that there are ways to heal through the traumatic process and elevate an individual to a state of well-being. And listed here are some of the main ways in which resilience can be triggered within individuals and can help them through their healing. So the first one is self-awareness. So for an individual to recognize the impact that the trauma has had on them and how they process that experience. So for example, learning what their triggers are, what are the things that can set off recollections of the trauma, and to work through those. Mindfulness, so this can take on a number of forms, be that physical exercise, visualization, meditation, yoga is another example. So these types of practice actually trigger the production of something called an endorphin within the brain. And that's actually also known as the happy hormone, which really does, lift a person's mood. And so once again, trying to take some time each day to practice mindfulness gives the individual a chance to reflect and contemplate on how they can move forward. Self-care is also very critical. Often when somebody has experienced a trauma, the result can be that they feel quite violated, and it can have an impact on their identity and their self-esteem and their self-worth. So to be able to recognize that, that the power of self-care can really go very far in helping them to come out of that frame of mind and to really show self-compassion, which is a crucial component in the healing process. Positive relationships too, as I mentioned earlier, they are one of the most important resilience factors. So if a person who's experienced a trauma has a network of support, and it doesn't have to be a lot of people, if 2 or 3 individuals who they know that they can rely on, who they can speak with without being judged, can really help that person to process their trauma and know that they have people around them who love them and care for them. And finally, feeling a sense of purpose can be very healing. So for a survivor of trauma, as I mentioned earlier, the trauma does not define them. That is something that they have experienced, but there is more to that individual than that negative experience alone. So for somebody to be able to find what their purpose is, it could be through voluntary work or learning a new skill, brushing up their resume and seeking employment. All of those can really help provide that person with drive and something to move towards as they recover from their trauma. So this concludes the section on trauma-informed practice, and we will now move on to the next section, which is the novel support links process. The Novel Support Links aims to provide holistic support for Muslim divorcees, widows and widowers who are based in the UK, Canada or the USA. So let's look at the philosophy of NSL. So we work according to the philosophy of empowerment. This is the basis of our work, and our goal is for it to infiltrate all aspects of our practice. In particular, it is crucial that our philosophy be implemented when dealing directly with applicants. So what does that actually mean? So the philosophy of empowerment allows applicants to make decisions around their lives and the actions that they would like to take on. As an NSL caseworker or as an NSL team, we provide the options for them and we respect their choice, even if it doesn't match what we feel that we may have done or what we feel is best for them. So how does our process work? The process for seeking support begins with an applicant visiting the NSL website and completing a registration form, which will tell us what their support needs are. So you would go to the website, which is up here, novelsupportlinks.com, and click on the Find Supports tab, which brings us here to the form. So it begins with the checklist of eligibility. So they have to be over 18 years of age. They have to be a Muslim widow, widower or divorcee, and they require some type of support. There is a fee of 25 Canadian dollars for each applicant. This is to ensure that our applicants are serious about utilising our services. However, if they are unable to pay, then we don't want that to be a barrier and we can then negotiate with them or waive the fee. Okay, and then there's just an introduction about the services that we offer. And then we get into the actual questions and information from the applicant. So it begins with just very basic logistical information. Name, address, phone number, gender, their location, languages, year of birth, and their level of education. So when we get to this area where from the level of education, this will actually provide quite important information to us as to their needs. So for example, if we know that they have completed college, then, and if one of their needs is to gain employment, then we are at a good place to be able to filter out opportunities for them. Similarly with their profession and occupation. Then again, we ask them to check, which situation applies to them. And we ask them a few details about the length of time since the divorce or bereavement and the length of the marriage and a little bit about circumstances. So these questions are really to give us some insight into whether there may be some trauma that they had experienced, and again, in terms of possible resources that we could offer. So we are asking these questions not to pry, but really to be able to focus what we can offer when we eventually meet with the applicant. We ask if they have children. So again, there may be applicants who have children that also require services. And again, our goal is to try and meet as many of the needs as possible. So once we have that information, we then ask them to identify the resources that they feel they need. And so we have a list there of the main areas that we would try to support them in. And then allow them a space for any further comments or information. They then just have to check the box to see that they've read the terms and conditions, and then they go on to the payment. And then finally, if part of their needs include finding a spouse, then they can just click on this button here, click on that link, and it will take them to the Find a Spouse registration form. So there we have it. It's a fairly straightforward form, and inshallah, our applicants will find it quite straightforward to be able to complete. So once that application form has been completed online by the applicant, it is received by NSL via the website. The form is then vetted and the applicant needs are identified, following which the NSL team will contact the applicant and confirm that we have received their form. We'll go through the identified needs and will inform them that a caseworker will be passed their information. At this stage, the applicant can choose whether or not to proceed and can also accept the caseworker that we are proposing or ask for an alternative. Following that, the application is passed to the caseworker, who will then initiate contact with the applicant and set up a meeting with them, either in person or online. Then, during the meeting, the caseworker will complete the intake form, which will contain the information provided by the applicant to provide as much information as possible. And then the completed intake form will be sent to NSL. The form is then reviewed by the NSL team and the next steps are established. And once we have done that, the applicant is contacted to discuss the NSL team review and to formulate a plan. And this may also require further input and assistance from the caseworker. So some of the key points for caseworkers who are working with NSL in relation to the process. So firstly, confidentiality is a non-negotiable pillar of our work, and it's something we cannot compromise on. It will ensure our credibility and also respects the privacy of our applicants. The information that they provide is actually an amana for us, and therefore we cannot share it without their permission. So in the same way as if somebody gave us their property to look after, we wouldn't use it for ourselves. And so in the same way, the information they provide is really not for us to share. This is particularly important given that we are working with a vulnerable population, and so to uphold their dignity and our own integrity is vital. If anyone from the NSL team, be they the core team, a caseworker, an admin assistant, if anyone discloses confidential information, then they will be immediately removed from the organization. And during the onboarding process, caseworkers will receive our governance policy and confidentiality agreement to sign. Once the application is received by a caseworker, if they know the applicant, then they must return that case back to the NSL team. This avoids any conflict of interest from occurring. When initiating contact with the applicant, this is a really great opportunity to introduce and set up the meeting and explain to the applicant briefly what the process will look like and to really put them at ease with our project. And then a final note for caseworkers is the intake form, which is a crucial document in the NSL process. It allows us to obtain information, identify the needs of the applicant, and to make recommendations. It provides the guidelines of what to ask of the applicant, and it's a record of the interview and observations that are made by the caseworker. So let's walk through the form. And this form really is a way for the caseworker to paint a picture of the situation as they observe it. Okay, so this is the Novel Support Links applicant intake form. It begins with the very basic information, the name of the caseworker and the NSL reference, which will be provided when the case is handed over. Here, this is where the caseworker puts in the date that the application form was received by them and the first contact date. This means the first time they contacted the applicant to set up the meeting. Now, ideally, we would appreciate up to a 3-day gap between receiving the application and the first contact date, just to keep up the momentum and for the applicant to know that, we're working towards meeting with them and beginning the process. However, there is some leeway, so we do allow up to 7 days to initiate that contact. But as I said, ideally 3 days is great. So this can be completed before the actual meeting with the client. At the meeting, this is the information that we will be obtaining from the client. So their contact information and their safety information, which is really crucial. So we ask here the standard question about their telephone number, but it is very important to ask them whether it's safe for us to call that number or whether they would prefer an alternative means of communication. The reason for this is that, as I mentioned, some of the applicants that we work with may have been in a domestic violence situation. Some elements of that may still be remaining in their interaction with their ex-spouse, particularly if children are involved. And so it's really important for us to know that we have their safety information. So if there are any notes around that, I mean, it may, for example, they may say that it's safe to call them after a certain time of day or on a particular number, and so on. So very, very important to include that. Then we just have again their address. Here, going back again to the safety aspect, if they do disclose that they feel unsafe or threatened by somebody in their network, then it's really important to list the name of that person or those people and to write down that relationship. So whether that's an ex-husband or somebody from the in-laws side, please note down the name and their relation to the applicant. The reason for this is that there may be situations where somebody who has been causing harm to the applicant finds out that they're trying to access services through NSL and may actually call up and impersonate somebody who's actually one of their support team. And again, we have a protocol around that because we do not disclose to anyone whether we are working with a particular individual. So even if somebody who, is a supporter of our applicant, we are still not able to confirm or deny whether they're working with us. Okay. And if there are ever any doubts or questions around safety or confidentiality about an applicant situation, please do reach out to one of the NSL team. Access needs. So as I mentioned, our philosophy is to empower our applicants. And that means that they should be able to understand what the information that we are providing is. And likewise, we should be able to understand them. So if they have access needs due to a language barrier, then, it's very useful to know that. So if necessary, we can arrange for an interpreter. Also, do they have access needs that are related to having a disability? This can be helpful for practical purposes, for instance, when we're working with them, but also it can give us an indication of whether there may be certain benefits that they could be entitled to. Another thing to think about when we're considering disability is that disability can come in a visible form, but also in an invisible form. So somebody may have a condition that results in extreme fatigue. And so knowing that would help us understand if perhaps they're not able to stay focused or they seem lethargic during an interview, for example. So that is a really useful piece of information. Their living situation. This is where we describe the condition of the place where the participant is residing currently, any needs that are identified there, Are they at the point of becoming homeless? Once again, this really provides us with the information we need to be able to think about what services we can provide and how we can support an applicant, and again, whether they're entitled to benefits. Then move on to the household and family, and again, the same information can provide us, a direction with regards to the benefits and services we can try to access. We ask them regarding their employment and education. Again, many applicants may, after the transition that they've experienced in their lives, be looking to be gaining economic independence and financial stability. So this information is helpful with that. And then finally, there's this section here, the participant service needs at intake. And so this is where the caseworker, based on their observation and interview with the applicant, can identify the needs that they feel are something that the applicant requires. Now, it is recommended that after this point, the caseworker does not fill out the rest of this form in the presence of the participant, but the rest of it is done in their own time and in their own space. That's because, the part of the caseworker's role is to provide an objective assessment of what they have viewed and observed during the interview and to make recommendations. And so if they're in that vicinity with the applicant, there's a possibility that bias could come in, or, the applicant may disagree or try to persuade them. So it's really to keep it as impartial as possible that we ask that the final parts of that form are filled in when the caseworker is alone and has had time to reflect. Okay, and finally, we have put a section here for caseworker recommendations. So, after having identified the needs, the caseworker can add any additional information or suggestions that they feel would be helpful. And then finally, we do ask how the participant heard about NSL. It's an optional question, but it just helps us to gauge how well our marketing and publicity is going. So that is the intake form, very crucial document, and really the pivot of how we're going to proceed with a particular application. Let's move now to look at the role of a novel support links caseworker. So the role of a caseworker is to assess the needs of our applicants and make recommendations to our team based upon observation and interview. So it's a very critical role that the caseworker plays. They really are the bridge between the applicant and the NSL team. So before considering the role of the NSL caseworker in more depth, let's take a look at some of the things to avoid. Let's think about what caseworkers are not. So it's natural to judge, it's human nature, but one thing we should be aware of is that we are judging, and to try and establish what our judgment is based upon. Is it on knowledge or on bias? Our applicants may already have faced stigma, they may feel misunderstood, and they may lack a strong support system. And our intention is not to reinforce that, so we must be mindful of our approach. For example, if an applicant had a chemical dependency, it could be easy to form a judgment. However, we would need to look more closely. As we learned, trauma can trigger such behavior. So let's ask ourselves, what has the applicant been through? This really is in line with our Islamic teachings. We have examples of our Holy Prophet ﷺ seeing the good in those who are often stigmatized. Two particular examples that come to mind are firstly when there was a companion who was ridiculing a man that was known to consume alcohol. And our Holy Prophet, rather than condemning the person who consumed the alcohol, actually reprimanded his companion and told him, "This man has the ability to make me smile." So he was actually looking at one of the positive aspects of this person's personality rather than degrading him or looking down upon him. A second example was one where there was a woman who was involved in a trade that was not very respectable, being again insulted by somebody. And once again, our Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam actually stopped that person from insulting her and said, this person may actually enter Jannah because she gave water to a dog that was thirsty. So she actually is a righteous person who performs good deeds. So once again, and these are very extreme forms of antisocial behavior, but we have this beautiful example from our Prophet about how to interact with such people and to really provide them with support, look at the positives. We're also not here to diagnose. However, we might like to think that we can diagnose whether somebody is experiencing something like depression or anxiety. It's not something that we can diagnose as a medical condition. If the applicant discloses from themselves that they are experiencing or they have a chronic condition, then that's something different, but it's certainly not our role to diagnose. The only thing we can do is suggest that they may wish to see their physician or their GP for further information and diagnosis. We're not there to pry. We shouldn't delve into the events that may have occurred unless it enables us to do our work. For example, if an applicant reveals that they experienced abuse within their marriage, we don't need all the details of what occurred. It's enough to know that they may require some kind of intervention and that there is possibly some trauma there to work through. Also, the applicant does have the choice to decline answering any of our questions. As we know, more information may come to light later in line with what we know about the impact of trauma on the brain, but it's not for us to try and force any information from the applicant if they're uncomfortable with that. It's also not our job to be the applicant's best friend. Boundaries should be established and maintained to avoid unrealistic expectations, and this protects both parties. It's also not our role to be their savior. Sometimes we may see our role as a rescuer to a helpless victim. However, this firstly contradicts our philosophy of empowerment because a person's experience does not define them. They may have experienced trauma or stress, but there is more to their life and what they can contribute. And surviving day to day in the midst of trauma shows incredible inner strength. So that is why in terms of language, we refer to those who have experienced trauma as survivors, not victims. Also we may find that the people that we're working with or an applicant from time to time, we may not click with. They may not be very likable. And this again could contradict, our notion of the perfect survivor or being the perfect caseworker. Often it's a very far cry from the truth. So that's something to recognize. Sharing our own experiences also is not often helpful. It's not relevant as the focus is really on the applicant. So we may want to share something that's happened to us, but this time and space is really for us to learn about the applicant, not to disclose our own personal information. Also, the situation of a caseworker could be very much different to that of the applicant, and so it may actually alienate them rather than being a support system. So the caseworker is really the face of NSL. The caseworker will most likely be the first person from the team who the applicant will meet, either in person or online. And first impressions are very important and they can really shape subsequent interaction. So the initial contact should be very positive and inviting. And then adhering to the philosophy of NSL. So once again, knowing and communicating to the applicant that the caseworker's role is to listen and to understand the client's situation and their related needs. And upholding the values of NSL. So our values are very much in accordance with Islamic teachings. We honor the experience of those who we are working with. We show them respect, humility, and compassion, to name just a few. And it is possible to maintain a respectable distance while demonstrating these. Let's look at some of the qualities and skills that an NSL caseworker should show. So the first one is trust and rapport. This will enhance subsequent communication. And, some ways to do this would be to begin with an introduction, to explain the purpose of the interview and its format. Explain to the applicant that all the information will be kept confidential and that the applicant has the right to pass on any questions that they don't wish to answer at that time. You should ask them if they have any questions and then begin. This will set the tone for the interview. So the applicant now has an understanding of exactly how the interview will pan out. And they also have the opportunity to seek clarification if anything needs extra explanation to them. Empathy, again, this really reaps rewards when working with applicants in a situation such as this. Even though we maintain our boundaries, it's okay to empathize and to put ourselves in the shoes of the applicant, especially if they are reporting something that we may not have a deep understanding of. So it's really important to have that empathy for them to be able to understand what they're going through. Reading between the lines is also a useful quality to have, because often what's not being said is just as revealing as what is. For example, the applicant may not reveal a desire for therapy, but maybe the caseworker might feel it could be helpful and could broach that with the applicant or put it down in the recommendations on the intake form. Active listening. This is a really important skill because, again, what's not being said is just as important. So through our gestures and body language, we can let the applicant know that we are hearing and listening to them. So nodding, smiling, they all indicate that we're present and attentive. And it's interesting that in communication, most impact is made through our body language. It's around 93%. So it's really important to be aware of your gestures and facial expressions when communicating with the applicant. Clear communication. So if 93% of our communication is expressed through body language, that leaves only 7% through what we are actually saying in a verbal manner. So we have to make the most of it by being clear. So do be honest. If an applicant asks a question that you can't answer, let them know that you'll get back to them. If they have an action item that they have to do, communicate with them when they should try to complete it by. So clear and direct communication, again, it can still be very polite and positive, but it just sets the stage very clearly. Don't overpromise. Setting reasonable expectations, again, is something that will really pay off in the end. It may be tempting to tell an applicant that you think they'll qualify for X or Y, but they may hear that as an assurance that they will receive that benefit or service. So instead, the role of the caseworker would be to remind them that the caseworker role is to communicate their needs to the NSL team, who will then make an assessment and contact them. And this way it sets a reasonable expectation, and so there's less opportunity for disappointment further down the line. Some of the pitfalls. So the first one is, again, the notion of the perfect survivor. As I mentioned earlier, there's no such thing. We may have a certain perception of the applicants, but we will most likely discover that our version is a far cry from reality. We may not click. Once again, you know, it's normal and natural that we've all been created with different personalities, and we may not resonate entirely with the applicant that we're working with. However, again, it's you know, really important to try to set aside those feelings as far as possible and really focus on the role, which is to identify the needs and gain an understanding of what that person is going through. This is actually a really good self-development process for us as well. You know, it can bring out those qualities and practices of patience, perseverance, and determination. And finally, there may be different values between us and the applicants that we're working with. It could occur, but again, our role is not to judge, and we are doing this work for the sake of Allah and to help those who are in difficult times. So far, our discussion has centered around the needs of the survivor. And whilst that is our priority, what is equally important to the team at NSL is that our team, including our caseworkers, are not compromising their safety at any point during their work with this project. If at any time during an interview a caseworker feels intimidated or unsafe, then they can leave or terminate that interview immediately and reach out to the NSL core team for support. We don't anticipate such instances, but in case it does occur, please know as caseworkers that your safety is a top priority for us, and we will support you in any way that we can to ensure your safety and well-being. We're now going to take part in a more interactive exercise where we will watch a short video around communication skills and make notes on how this communication could be improved.
Hannah, I talked with you, I know, the other day, but I just wanted to touch base today, you know, about your stuff, your situation. So I read your chart, and I know we talked last time. Are you still feeling depressed? Yeah, a depression. And I know you're feeling depressed now, but I felt depressed before, and it will pass. Like, you'll get over it. It's not that big of a deal. And so this depression, why are you feeling depressed? Oh, wait, sorry, I had another note. Something else I wanted to ask you before. No, why, or is that depression what brought you in here? Well, I OD'd earlier because I was depressed. Really sad. Yeah. Okay, so that overdose, we'll have to talk about. So then why are you feeling depressed? Well, I was abused earlier. I just don't. I mean, your life doesn't. I looked in your chart, and your life doesn't seem all that bad. So this depression, I think you can get over it. Yeah. Let me look at my notes here. I know we saw. Oh, hey. Yeah. Can I talk to you later? I'm gonna finish talking now. Okay. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Let me look at my notes here. You got the abuse, the overdose. So can we talk about these thoughts? Oh, that, like that area. Do you want to, are you still having those thoughts? No. No? Okay, then. Great. No thoughts? Because I know, I mean, if you're having them, it's kind of like, I don't understand why people think of like killing themselves. It's really very weak of them to do, personally. But anywho's, oh, hold on a second. Hello? No, I'm at work right now. Yeah, you know at Belmont. Yeah, I'm gonna talk with this patient here. Yeah, and I'll call you back. Okay. Okay. I'm sorry. Yeah. Anywho, so let me look at my notes. But so you, those thoughts we were saying, what were you saying about those? Did you have them? I forget. Well, no. Okay, that's great. I'm glad. So are you feeling better then? I guess a little. Yeah. So what do you think has worked in your therapy? I like talking to the therapist. One-on-one? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Well, do you want me to see if your doctor's available? I can totally arrange that. Okay, I'm gonna go check that then right now. Okay.
So from that video, try to make a note of the techniques that could use improvement. And obviously there were some aspects of this interview that were exaggerated, but it gives an interesting perspective on what to avoid and how to really keep that interview and observation survivor-centered. Moving on now to the interview technique. Firstly, let's look at asking questions. So you'll see here that these interview questions are all very open-ended, which means that they don't need a yes or no answer. And this is important because it provides the applicant time and space to be able to really describe their situation. And that in turn allows the caseworker to gain an understanding of the situation that they are in. In addition to asking questions that provide information, it's also important as a caseworker to seek clarification. There may be some areas that you don't quite understand. And again, here are some phrases that could be helpful in that type of situation. So, for example, let's look at the second one. What I'm hearing from you is, and then you explain your understanding. And this has, again, a very gentle impact because you're asking for further information without sounding as though you're interrogating the applicant. Finally, the aspect of validation. Again, very important in building trust and rapport and showing the client that you understand their situation and that you can empathize with them. So, you know, these are ways in which you're validating their experience. They may have done something which they later realized wasn't the most helpful course of action, for example. And you can respond by saying, I can see what you were trying to do there. So again, we're showing that empathy and compassion. There's no concept of blame or shame being projected onto the applicant. And similarly, when they're making a good decision, to acknowledge that, I think that you've made a great decision. And at all times to remind them that you're there as a support as they need. So our final exercise is a role play where you will be asked to open the link to the NSL intake form. And that link will be in the comments on this YouTube video. And if you could take the intake form and conduct a mock interview with a partner, you can find a family member or a friend and just go through it, trying to use the skills and techniques that were presented today. And then think about what went well, any challenges, and whether there are any areas of development that you identified within yourself. So this brings us to the conclusion of session 1 of the NSL training. Our next steps from this are whether you would like to proceed on the process to becoming an NSL caseworker, whether you have any questions about the role or anything else that has been covered in this training, and whether you are open to receiving further training periodically through NSL. We will endeavour to make the training sessions interactive, relevant, and time appropriate as far as we are able to do so. And finally, Finally, we wish to thank you for your interest in the work of Novel Support Links and for taking the time to attend this module. Inshallah, we hope that your interest will remain and that you do continue with the next steps to join our NSL